"You know what you did to my family," the thing whispered, its mouth moving impossibly against the vinyl, breath somehow warm against her ear despite the doll being 3 feet away on the mantel. The ceramic logs in the fireplace burst into flames without her touching the gas valve, blue tongues licking upward as if eager to receive an offering. Every light bulb in the house exploded simultaneously, raining glass, while the doll's button eyes tracked her movement through the sudden darkness. She'd bought the cursed thing from an estate sale 3 days ago. A Labubu collectible from some dead woman's bedroom, grotesque and endearing in equal measure with its pointed ears and stitched smile. The seller had practically thrown it at her for $5, muttering about finally getting rid of the damn thing before slamming the front door. Now Mia understood why as the creature's head rotated a full circle, vertebrae crackling like old wood, while it maintained perfect eye contact. Her grandmother's warning echoed from childhood. Never bring home objects that belonged to the desperate dead. The woman at the estate sale had looked desperate. Hollowed cheeks, trembling hands, dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in weeks. But Mia's own desperation had been stronger. The foreclosure notice burning in her back pocket, the need for something, anything, to flip for profit, overriding every instinct that screamed danger. The doll giggled, a sound like marbles rolling down a drain. "You thought you could make money from me, didn't you? Sell me to some other fool?" Its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, seeming to originate from inside her own skull. The temperature in the room plummeted until her breath misted, and frost began forming on the windows despite the August heat outside. Her phone buzzed with a text from her own number. "Look behind you." She didn't turn around. She couldn't. The thing on the mantel held her gaze like a snake mesmerizing prey, its smile stretching wider than the vinyl should allow, revealing tiny white teeth that definitely hadn't been there before. Her dog Rex whimpered from the kitchen, then fell silent in a way that made her stomach clench. The grandfather clock in the hallway began chiming midnight, even though her watch read 3:47 p.m. "Poor little Mia," the doll crooned, always trying to take shortcuts, always looking for the easy money, just like her father did. Her blood turned to ice. Nobody knew about her father's gambling debts except family, and most of them were dead. The doll somehow knew about the loan sharks, about the reason he'd really left when she was 12, about the bruises her mother had hidden under makeup for months afterward. The floorboards creaked behind her, heavy, deliberate footsteps that couldn't belong to Rex. She spun around and saw nothing, but when she looked back, the doll had moved closer, now sitting on the coffee table instead of the mantel, legs swinging like a child's. It held her father's old wallet in its tiny hands, flipping through credit cards that should have been cancelled 15 years ago. "He sold me first, you know," the doll said conversationally. "Bought me for your 8th birthday, then pawned me 3 days later for poker money. I've been waiting ever since for someone with his blood to claim me properly." Its eyes weren't button anymore. They were human, brown like her father's, filled with the same desperate hunger that had driven him to destruction. The house groaned around her, walls settling with sounds like breaking bones. Picture frames tilted sideways without being touched. The hardwood floor beneath her feet began to sag and warp, forming a slow spiral with the doll at its center. She tried to step backward, but her feet wouldn't obey, drawn inexorably toward the thing that wore her father's eyes. Her laptop opened by itself on the dining table, screen flickering to life. Photos she'd never seen before filled the monitor, her father shaking hands with a thin woman in vintage clothing, signing papers in what looked like the same house where she'd bought the doll. More photos, the woman growing gaunt and hollow-eyed over time, the doll always present in the background, watching. The final image showed the woman hanging from a ceiling fan, the doll sitting peacefully on the bed below. 7 owners since your daddy, the doll explained helpfully. Each one thought they could profit from me. Each one learned the price of greed. It hopped down from the coffee table, landing with a solid thunk that shook the entire house. Despite being barely 2 feet tall, it moved with the weight of something much larger, each step creating spiderweb cracks in the floorboards. The walls began to bleed, not red, but black, thick liquid that smelled like burning plastic and decay. The substance formed words as it dripped. 7 days, payment due, interest compounding. Her father's debts somehow transferred to this abomination, somehow binding her through blood and shared greed. She lunged for the fireplace poker, but it crumbled to rust in her hands. The doll laughed, that horrible marble sound, and suddenly she wasn't in her living room anymore, but in a vast, dark space filled with the whispers of previous owners. 7 voices pleading, bargaining, promising anything to make the nightmare stop. She saw them clearly now, businessmen and housewives, students and retirees, all united by the same fatal flaw that had destroyed her father. The contract is quite simple, the doll said, and now it towered over her, grown to human size while retaining its childish proportions. 7 years of service for 7 years of prosperity. Your father tried to break the deal early. Very rude. The interest has been substantial. She found herself back in the living room, but it was wrong. Too big, too empty, furniture floating inches off the ground. The doll had returned to its normal size, but something fundamental had shifted. She could feel the contract binding her, invisible chains wrapping around her soul. 7 years of being its servant, or join the whispers in the dark forever. But Mia had learned something her father never did. Sometimes the only way to break a bad deal is to destroy what makes it possible. She'd specialized in insurance fraud investigation before losing that job, had spent years learning how fires started and spread, how evidence could be obliterated completely. If the doll was tied to physical form, then fire might sever that connection. She pulled the emergency gasoline can from the garage, hands steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. The doll watched with amusement as she doused it thoroughly, then soaked the entire mantle for good measure. Fire won't work, it said with absolute certainty. I've survived 7 fires, 3 floods, and 1 very determined woman with a wood chipper. But Mia wasn't trying to destroy the doll. She was destroying something else entirely. Those papers from the estate sale, the ones she'd stuffed in her junk drawer without reading. The bill of sale that made her the legal owner, the document that bound her to the contract. She pulled them out and held them over the flames. The doll's confidence wavered. "Wait," it said, voice rising to a childish whine. "You can't do that. The contract requires a willing owner," Mia said, finally understanding. "Someone who accepts possession knowing what they're getting. But if I never legally owned you..." She touched the papers to the flames. The doll shrieked, a sound like air brakes and breaking glass. It rushed toward her, but as the papers caught fire, it began to fade, becoming translucent. "You don't understand," it wailed. "Without an owner, I go back to the void. The others, they'll come with me." She heard them then, 7 voices screaming in terror as they were dragged back to whatever darkness had spawned this thing. For a moment, she wavered, guilt twisting her stomach. But then she remembered the photos, the hanging woman, her father's hollow eyes in those final months. The papers turned to ash. The doll dissolved like smoke, taking its impossible weight and presence with it. The house settled back to normal. Lights working, floors level, walls clean. Her phone showed the correct time. Rex barked happily from the kitchen, tail wagging. But Mia knew she'd never be the same. The insurance money from the accidental fire damage would save her house, but she'd learned the true cost of taking shortcuts. Every estate sale, every antique shop, every too good to be true deal would remind her of button eyes and marble laughter. She moved across the country within a month, but sometimes in the early morning hours when sleep eluded her, she could swear she heard distant whispers from 7 grateful voices, thanking her for finally setting them free. The nightmares were worth it, she told herself. Besides, she'd learned something valuable about breaking contracts that couldn't be found in any law book. Sometimes the most binding agreements were the ones you never really signed at all. The burn scars on her hands never fully faded, but they served as a permanent reminder. There are some prices too high to pay, no matter how desperate you become. Her father had forgotten that lesson. She never would again. 3 years passed in blissful normalcy. Mia rebuilt her life in Oregon, working as a legitimate antiques appraiser. Her expertise in detecting fraud now channeled toward helping clients avoid cursed objects and fraudulent pieces. She'd developed an almost supernatural ability to sense wrongness in old items, a skill that made her invaluable and well paid. The house she rented sat on 2 acres of pine forest, isolated enough that she could sleep without neighbors' sounds disturbing the fragile peace she'd constructed. Rex had passed away the previous winter, old age taking him gently in his sleep, and she'd buried him under the oak tree where he'd loved to nap. The loneliness was manageable. Silence meant safety. On a Tuesday morning in October, Mia found the package on her doorstep. No delivery truck had come up the long gravel drive. She would have heard it. No footprints marked the frost-covered porch except her own from the previous evening. The box sat there as if it had always existed, wrapped in brown paper that felt oily under her fingers, tied with string that looked suspiciously like the kind used in the 1940s. Her name was written on the label in her father's handwriting. She should have burned it immediately, should have loaded it into her truck and driven to the nearest industrial incinerator. Instead, she carried it inside with the same fatal curiosity that had doomed her father, that had drawn her to estate sales and too good to be true deals. Inside the box, nestled in yellow tissue paper, sat a photograph. It showed her father as a young man, maybe 25, standing in what looked like a curio shop. His arm was draped around a thin woman with kind eyes and graying hair. The same woman from the estate sale where she'd bought the doll. But this photo was decades old, judging by the clothing and the sepia tone. On the back, in her father's familiar scrawl, Margaret Chen, 1987, She tried to warn me. Below that, in different handwriting, feminine, shaky, the contract transfers through bloodline. Destroying the anchor only delays collection. Tell Mia I'm sorry. M. The room tilted sideways. Mia gripped the kitchen counter, fighting nausea as the implications crashed over her. Margaret Chen. The woman at the estate sale hadn't been the owner. She'd been trying to return the doll to its rightful bloodline. The woman in the hanging photo, the one who'd killed herself rather than serve 7 years, had been someone else entirely. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Hello, Mia. The voice was Margaret's, crackling through static from whatever realm the dead occupied. I tried to stop you from taking it. I tried to break the cycle. You're dead, Mia whispered. Death is just another form of contract, Margaret replied sadly. I've been watching you these 3 years, hoping the binding was truly broken. But burning the papers only severed your legal ownership. The blood debt remains. Through her kitchen window, Mia saw them gathering in the tree line. 7 figures in various states of decay, the doll's previous owners, their faces bearing the same hollow desperation that had marked her father's final years. They moved with purpose now, no longer trapped in servitude, but empowered by her mistake. When you destroyed the anchor, Margaret continued, you released us all from the doll's direct control. But the original contract your father signed, that was with something much older. The doll was just a vessel. Now we're free to collect the debt ourselves. The 7 figures stepped from the shadows. Businessmen and housewives, students and retirees, all bearing the wounds that had killed them. The hanging woman's neck twisted at an impossible angle. A man in an expensive suit had his throat opened ear to ear. A college-aged girl was soaked in blood from wrist to elbow. 7 years of your life, they chanted in unison, or join our collection. But Mia had learned more than just contract law in those 3 peaceful years. She'd studied her father's real mistakes, traced his connection to Margaret Chen, researched the occult with the same methodical precision she applied to antique authentication. She knew something these walking corpses didn't. The original contract was with my father, she said, backing toward the fireplace where she kept more than just decorative tools. But my father never served his 7 years. He broke the contract through death, didn't he? That's why you've been waiting, because the debt transferred incomplete. The figures paused. Margaret's voice grew uncertain. Yes, but a contract requires willing participation from a living signatory. Mia pulled her father's suicide note from the mantel, the real one, not the forgery the family had released to save his reputation. He didn't run out on gambling debts. He killed himself rather than serve. That means the contract was voided through breach of terms. She held up the note, her father's final words clearly visible. I won't give them 7 years. I won't become their slave. Forgive me, Mia. The debt dies with me. But the bloodline, one of the figures protested. Can't inherit void contracts, Mia finished. She'd spent 3 years researching this moment, consulting lawyers both living and dead, learning the arcane rules that governed supernatural agreements. My father chose death over service. That voids any transfer clause. The 7 figures began to fade, their borrowed time running out. But they didn't go quietly. If we can't collect the debt, the hanging woman snarled, we can still take revenge. They rushed forward as one, spectral hands reaching for her throat. But Mia had prepared for this too. Salt circles, iron filings, protective wards painted in lamb's blood. Every protection she'd learned in 3 years of obsessive research. The spirits struck the barriers and recoiled, their forms becoming more translucent with each failed attempt. Without a valid contract to empower them, they were just angry ghosts, and ghosts had rules. "You can't touch me," Mia said with growing confidence. "You have no claim on me. The debt died with my father, and you know it." Margaret's voice came one last time, filled with bitter admiration. "Clever girl. Your father would be proud." The phone line went dead. The 7 figures stood at the edge of her protective circle, impotent and fading. As the sun rose higher, they dissolved completely, leaving only the faint smell of old graves and broken promises. Mia burned the photograph and her father's suicide note together, watching the flames consume the last physical evidence of the supernatural contract. This time, she was certain it was over. But as the ashes scattered in the morning breeze, she noticed something that chilled her blood. There, in the tree line where the spirits had first appeared, a small figure watched from the shadows. The Labubu doll stood motionless between 2 pine trees, no longer bound to serve or collect debts. It had reverted to its original purpose, not as a supernatural anchor, but as something far worse. A recruiting tool. Its button eyes reflected the morning sun as it raised one tiny hand in a cheerful wave. Then it turned and walked deeper into the forest, heading toward the main road where other desperate people might find it. Mia realized with dawning horror that she hadn't destroyed the curse at all. She'd simply set it free to find new victims, new bloodlines to corrupt, new contracts to forge. The doll was patient. It had waited decades between her father and herself. It could wait decades more. She was safe, but somewhere out there, another desperate person would soon discover a cute collectible doll at a roadside stand, priced too good to pass up, and the cycle would begin again, as it had been beginning for generations before her father ever laid eyes on those button eyes and stitched smile. The true horror wasn't being trapped by the curse. It was knowing she'd released it to trap others and being powerless to stop what came next.